So smallpox is a disease that plagued humanity for hundreds of years. The symptoms were fever and nausea, and then you'd start getting little bumps on your skin. In order to transmit it, it was very easy, just skin contact or coughing or even touching something that the infected touched, and you could contract it. They say that 3 out of 10 people who contracted the disease died from it, and an estimated 300 to 500 million people over the course of just the 20th century alone died because of smallpox. But on May 8th, 1980, the World Health Organization declared that smallpox had been eradicated. Truly on that day, the world received good news. But what if I told you that the victory over smallpox was a small thing in comparison to what the Apostle Paul says? That he says that there's something more important than the victory over smallpox, that we can have ultimate victory over death itself and have eternal life with Christ. If I was to tell you that, would you want to know more? For Paul, he opens up his book to the Romans with a thesis statement. And the main point that he's trying to get across is that the gospel offers salvation and it reveals righteousness. Between those two concepts, he will talk in depth for the rest of the entire book. Romans 1:16 to 17 is our passage for today, and it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith." So in Romans 1:16, Paul opens saying, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel." But what is this word, the gospel? We tend to think in Christian terms of the gospel as some concept, but sometimes we don't exactly know what it is. So the gospel actually appears 4 times in the first 17 verses of Romans, which kind of act as the introduction to the book of Romans as a whole. And it comes from the Greek word evangelion, which is where we get evangelist or evangelical from. And it simply means good news. It's actually reflective of an idea in the Old Testament where Isaiah and Isaiah 57 or 52:7 says, "How delightful on the mountains are the feet of the one who brings the good news." Now, Paul refers to what I would call 2 different gospels, especially the gospel of God in Romans. And he would differentiate that between the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, it was important for the original audience, who is primarily Jewish, who would want to understand how this related to Jesus. Now, the gospel of God is what you might refer to as the Bible. That is the story of God's work in time from creation to the fall to the nation of Israel, all the way to Jesus and beyond into eternity. And this is actually the gospel that Stephen gives in Acts 7 when he proclaims the gospel. On the other hand, we have the gospel of Jesus Christ, which specifically refers to what Jesus did, the second member of the Trinity, coming down from heaven, living a perfect life, ultimately dying on the cross, and then raising from the dead, and that's implications for us as believers. Now, when presenting the gospel in Acts 2, this is the gospel that Peter presents, talking about Jesus. Now, I want you to not get confused by these terms, because ultimately the conclusion is the same. And it's God's divine plan that offers us salvation. So after he talks about not being ashamed of the gospel, and he goes on in verse 16 to say that the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. So he's not only saying that the gospel is something you shouldn't be ashamed of, but also that it's the means of salvation. Knowledge alone is insufficient. Genuine faith provokes action into a person. Now, let's say you had a buddy of yours who was an employee for an up-and-coming technology company. And he says, "This technology that my company is coming out with is life-changing. It's going to change the world by this existing." And you can look at him with some skepticism, and having that knowledge, maybe that's pretty cool. But if you really believed what he said, you might actually invest in that company, might buy some stock, and the return on investment would be pretty substantial. Now, granted, that's insider trading, that's illegal, and this is not legal advice. But the point is that that Paul is trying to get across here that a true faith is one that provokes action. Having a simple knowledge of the gospel, plenty of people have that, but it's when the gospel provokes that change, that causes a person to take action upon it. That's the kind of faith that Paul is talking about. Now, he also goes on in the end of it to talk about how that God has offered salvation not just to the Jews, but to the Gentiles also. He says the Greeks, that is the non-Jews. And for the Jews, they're throughout history. They started at Abraham. He was supposed to be the progenitor of the nation of Israel that was going to be this great, wonderful nation, the shining city on a hill, as it's described, where everybody from miles around could look up and go, wow, those are the people who really believe in the one true God. But ultimately, through idolatry and moral failing and all kinds of sin, they fell out of favor. But it was still through this nation that Jesus came, because Jesus was a Jew. And it was through Jesus swinging the gates wide open for anybody to be saved, the Jew first, and also to the non-Jew, for us to be able to believe in him and be able to come to salvation through this message of the gospel. And that's what Paul is trying to get out in that. And then finally, the other aspects. So we first talked about the gospel as the means of salvation. The second thing that he talks about is that the righteousness of God is revealed. So the gospel reveals the righteousness from faith to faith, is what verse 17 says. One of my favorite things, favorite pastimes, if you will, is looking up silly laws in America. And I came across one that was, did you know in Little Rock, Arkansas, it is illegal for you to honk your horn at a restaurant that sells cold drinks and sandwiches after 9 p.m. So this law sounds ridiculous, right? Now, it would be in your best interest, if you were to go to Little Rock, for you to follow this law. Because if you were found honking your horn at McDonald's, you could actually get ticketed. You could get fined for violating that law. It is in your best interest to follow this ridiculous law. But what if I was to tell you, I agree with this law. I'm happy that this law exists. Because this was actually part of a counteraction to noise issues, where a lot of people were being really loud and road rage and all kinds of chaos going on, where this was amidst several laws that were in an attempt to lower noise pollution. Because after 9 p.m., people are winding down for their sleep because maybe they have work or school in the morning. But ultimately, it was for their good. It's this kind of back and forth that we just had that is what we have with God. That at first we don't understand what God is doing. God, I don't get it. Your word says this, I don't understand, but I trust you anyway. And through that, God himself honors us, and he reveals himself to us to the point where we're awestruck and go, wow, it's amazing. So we have a greater faith, and we believe in him and trust in him more. He reveals himself more. It creates this cycle of this relationship between us and God, where we are able to build that very healthy, wonderful relationship with our Father. And ultimately, this is what Paul is trying to get across in Romans. Because with these two aspects, with the gospel offering salvation and revealing righteousness, all else comes secondary to this. Because he's going to continue on for chapters and chapters of theologically dense information. And in fact, in Romans 15, Paul actually says that he admires the Romans and their knowledge, and that he appreciates them for how great of a knowledge that they have. But the shortcoming that their shortcomings are that they don't embrace and share the gospel like they should. So when he says, "For I am not ashamed," he wants them to not be ashamed. For the gospel offers salvation and reveals righteousness. For as it says, Romans 1:16, "For the gospel is the power of salvation to everyone who believes, and for in it the righteousness of God is revealed, faith